Elizabeth stepped out of her gleaming supercar, her cold eyes sliding over Logan's battered AE86 before she laughed openly, in front of the crowd. To her, the grease-stained single father was just another man pretending to be something he wasn't. But a few hours later, on a rain-slicked mountain pass with her brakes cut and death waiting around a single curve, that same ridiculed AE86 came tearing through the darkness like a ghost. One perfect drift changed everything she thought she knew about power, about wealth, and about the kind of man she had never taken the time to see. Stay with this story until the very end, because the secret behind that drift cuts deeper than any assassination attempt ever could. The Hargrove Summit, a resort launch, was exactly the kind of event that reminded Elizabeth Hargrove why she had spent 15 years building an empire. The valley below was swallowed in morning mist, but up here on the terraced hillside, everything was razor-sharp and curated. White linen tables arranged in perfect arcs, champagne flutes catching light from discreet solar lamps, and a procession of vehicles along the entrance lane that looked more like a curated auto show than a business gathering. Lamborghinis and Bentleys sat gleaming alongside a custom electric Porsche belonging to a media conglomerate executive whose name carried weight in 3 countries. Elizabeth's team had spent 7 months designing this moment, and it was performing exactly as planned. Then Logan Mercer pulled up in the AE86. The car was white with a black hood, a combination that had once been striking and was now simply honest about its age. The rocker panels carried a faint shadow of rust, and a shallow crease ran along the passenger door where it had once traded paint with something larger and hadn't lost much sleep over it. The engine, however, did not sound like a machine that had been neglected. It idled with a low, disciplined pulse, entirely unconcerned about the company it was keeping. Logan stepped out in clean but worn work pants and a collared shirt that had seen the inside of a garage far more than a boardroom, and reached into the back seat for a clipboard. He was not there to impress anyone. Logan had been contracted by the event logistics firm to inspect the support vehicles, the vans, the shuttle cars, the catering transport, and to certify that everything running along the mountain road that afternoon was mechanically sound. It was the kind of work that never got thanked and rarely got noticed, which suited him perfectly. He was 38 years old, the sole parent of a 7-year-old girl named Daisy, and he ran a one-man garage at the base of the mountain that served locals who couldn't afford dealership labor rates. He had no interest in the champagne, no patience for small talk about market projections, and no illusions about where he stood in the hierarchy of that particular afternoon. Elizabeth noticed the AE86 the moment she finished greeting a cluster of investors near the terrace. Her eyes moved to it the way a homeowner's eyes move to a weed through the patio tiles, not with fury, but with the reflexive irritation of something that is simply out of place. She said something low to the man beside her, a senior vice president who had mastered laughing at exactly the right moments, and then said it louder for the nearby guests to catch. She called the car an eyesore. She said whoever drove it must have taken a wrong turn looking for the junkyard. She laughed, and several people laughed with her, because laughter is the fastest currency in a room full of people trying to seem like they belong. Logan heard it. He didn't react visibly, didn't stop moving his pen across the clipboard, didn't look up from the undercarriage of the catering van. He had learned long ago that silence was not the same as agreement. When he finished the inspection, he walked past the gathered crowd to reach the last vehicle on his list, and Elizabeth stepped into his path without quite meaning to, still speaking to her companions. He excused himself quietly. She looked at him fully for the first time, taking in the clipboard, the smudge of grease at his wrist, the car in the distance. She said it clearly enough for the people nearest her to hear that some vehicles belonged behind the venue rather than in front of it, and the same could usually be said for the people driving them. Logan looked at her for a moment. He said, quietly, that in his experience, the cars that actually worked were usually the ones that didn't bother looking expensive. Then he stepped past her and went back to work. The comment landed strangely in Elizabeth's chest in a way she couldn't immediately name. She had her security director tell a junior staffer to have the AE86 moved to the rear service area before the afternoon photographs were taken, and she moved on to her next engagement. But the afternoon's smoothness had developed a small, persistent snag that she chose not to examine. What Logan had actually been doing, just before Elizabeth intercepted him, was staring at the front axle of her personal vehicle, a matte black luxury sedan armored by her security firm. He had seen a faint discoloration on the brake caliper housing and a smear pattern near the hydraulic line fitting that didn't match normal wear. It looked like someone had been at the line, carefully, deliberately, with enough skill to make the work appear untouched. He flagged the vehicle on his inspection form and went to find someone in Elizabeth's security detail. The man he found said he'd pass it along. Logan was not confident that he would. Elizabeth Hargrove had not built a company worth $400 million by being soft, and she knew it. She had grown up watching her father's construction business collapse under a bad partnership, spent her 20s clawing back through real estate acquisitions and leveraged development deals, and learned that trust was a luxury that cost more than it paid. Her boardroom table had seen 7 different CFOs in 11 years, not because she was cruel, but because she was exact, and exactness was something most people found exhausting over time. She was 41, unmarried by choice, and had long since decided that vulnerability was a business liability she could not afford. Her younger sister Mia was the exception to every rule Elizabeth kept. Mia was 34, ran a non-profit training underprivileged youth in landscape architecture, and showed up to Elizabeth's events the way little sisters always do, slightly underdressed, impossibly warm, and unable to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She caught Elizabeth near the terrace before the afternoon convoy departed. Her voice was low but urgent. She said she'd been hearing things from people who monitored Carter Whitfield's movements. Carter, the developer who had spent the last 9 months trying to purchase the Hargrove Summit project through increasingly aggressive offers. Elizabeth had rejected everyone. Carter had stopped calling, which Mia said did not mean he had stopped planning. Elizabeth listened with the expression of someone who had already decided the conversation wasn't worth altering her schedule for. She said Carter was a businessman, not a criminal, and that the threats Mia described, vague whispers from vague sources, were exactly the kind of noise that surrounded every high-value project. She said Mia worried too much because Mia had never operated at this level, and said it not with cruelty but with flat certainty. Mia did not argue. She had learned that arguing with Elizabeth directly was like arguing with a load-bearing wall. The wall wouldn't move and you'd end up with bruised hands. Logan had spent the first hour after his report to security waiting. When no response came, he went looking for the vehicle himself. The sedan had been moved to the departure staging area, and he found it easy enough to get close for a second inspection. What he saw confirmed his suspicion. The brake line fitting had been loosened by small, precise increments, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to ensure progressive hydraulic pressure loss under sustained braking on a long, downhill run. It was a mechanic's sabotage, invisible from above, invisible in a casual walkthrough, and precisely lethal on the right road. Logan felt the cold, specific dread of someone who understands exactly what a system failure looks like and exactly when it will happen. He went to Elizabeth directly. When she came through the staging area with her entourage, he stepped forward and said he needed 60 seconds. He told her clearly the brake line, the location, the nature of the interference. He said she should not enter that vehicle before it was inspected by someone she trusted completely. Elizabeth looked at him with an expression he would describe to himself as contempt, with a thin layer of patience applied over it. She said the vehicle had been certified by a professional security firm, that she paid extremely well for that certainty, and that a man who drove a car held together by memory and routine was not the most credible source of second opinions. The people around her were watching. Logan said nothing more. He walked back to his AE86, sat in the driver's seat, and stared through the windshield at the convoy forming in the late afternoon light. He could leave. His contract ended at the close of the setup phase, and there was no professional obligation holding him to this hillside. He thought about Daisy, asleep by now at his mother's house down the mountain, arms wrapped around the stuffed rabbit she'd carried everywhere since she was 3. He thought about another mountain road, on a night 11 years ago, when he had been the one in the driver's seat and someone had trusted him at high speed, and how close that night had come to ending differently. He started the AE86 and pulled out from the service area at a distance the convoy wouldn't register. Carter Whitfield was not at the event. He had been watching from a laptop in a rented house 14 kilometers away, through a camera system his team had installed 3 days prior. When the convoy cleared the resort gate, he made a call. The instructions were simple and had been rehearsed. It was going to look like a terrible accident on a wet road. It was going to end with Elizabeth Hargrove no longer in a position to refuse his offers, and a project worth considerably more than its advertised value falling into his hands before the month was out. He closed the laptop and waited. The rain arrived without particular drama, which was itself a kind of warning. Mountain weather in that region was usually theatrical, sudden drops in pressure, wind that announced itself through the tree line, clouds that stacked and darkened before the first drop fell. But this rain simply appeared, a steady curtain that materialized around the convoy as it entered the deeper section of the pass, as though the road itself had exhaled it. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in 10 minutes. The asphalt, which had been dry and warm from a full day of sun, began to slick over with the particular treachery of a surface that has gone from bone-dry to wet without the intermediate soak that gives experienced drivers their warning period. Elizabeth sat in the rear of her sedan reviewing projected revenue figures for the resort's first operational quarter. Her driver, a 20-year veteran named Frank who had driven her to and from more airports than either of them could count, navigated the curves with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this road in every condition. The heater was on. The rain was background. Elizabeth had a call scheduled for 6 o'clock and was preparing for it with the focused efficiency of a person who had learned to use every available minute. She had not thought about Logan or the AE86 since the staging area. Frank felt it first. He had the experienced driver's sensitivity to his vehicle's behavior, the subtle translation of the road's grip through the steering column, the micro-vibrations of the chassis communicating what the tires were doing against the surface. When he applied the brakes gently on the first serious descent, the car's response was marginally slower than it should have been. He attributed it to the wet road and reduced his speed. When he braked again at the next curve, the response was slower still, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed an ordinary driver, but enough to register a precise wrongness in a man who had spent 2 decades learning how cars tell the truth. He said nothing to Elizabeth yet. But on the third curve, when the pedal traveled 5 millimeters further than it should have before the car responded, he understood. He said her name. He said they had a brake issue and that he was going to manage their speed down to the first available shoulder. Elizabeth looked up from the tablet. She took in the rain against the windows, the guardrail flashing past, the elevation visible where the drop fell away beyond the outer lane. She did not panic. Panic was not in her operational vocabulary, but her body understood something her discipline had not yet finished acknowledging, and her hand gripped the armrest with a pressure she was entirely unaware of applying. 2 vehicles emerged from the darkness behind the convoy. They had been running without lights on the upper section, trailing at enough distance to avoid attention, and they appeared from behind the last security vehicle, with the sudden coordination of machines operated by people who had rehearsed this. The SUVs were large and dark, moving with deliberate purposefulness. They split, one to pressure the lead security truck, the other accelerating toward Elizabeth's sedan. Frank tried to raise the lead vehicle on the radio. The response was static. The cellular signal was gone. A jammer had been triggered somewhere in the convoy. The SUV pressed against the sedan's rear quarter with the persistent, angled force of a vehicle trying to steer another vehicle rather than stop it. Frank fought for his lane. The outer edge of the road was perhaps 40 centimeters from the right tires, beyond which the mountain fell away into complete darkness and rainfall. Elizabeth looked through the rear window and saw the headlights of the SUV. Massive and deliberate, riding her sedan's tail with the intimacy of something that intended to consume her. There was nothing in her life, not a negotiation, not a lawsuit, not a hostile acquisition, that had prepared her for the animal reality of someone trying to kill her on a wet road in the dark, with every tool she relied on entirely absent from the situation. The brake system lost another measure of pressure with each application. Frank's foot was traveling nearly to the floor on the steeper pitches. He told Elizabeth they were losing all braking function. He told her to brace. The SUV made its move, slamming into the sedan's rear corner with enough force to break traction at the rear axle, and the car began a slow, terrible rotation toward the outer lane and the drop beyond the guardrail. Elizabeth did not scream. She locked eyes with Frank's reflection in the rearview mirror and saw a man doing everything he knew how to do, which was not going to be enough. Then a sound broke through the rain, a high-frequency mechanical note that was distinct from everything else in the dark. Headlights appeared from an angle that made no immediate sense, moving through the upper section of road above the convoy with the speed of something that had chosen its commitment point and was fully in it. The AE86 came down the mountain not like a rescue and not like a stunt, but like a correction, like a precise and necessary piece of mathematics inserting itself into a problem that had been constructed to have only one answer. Logan had seen the SUVs pull out from the hillside junction above the convoy. He had seen them kill their lights. He had spent 7 years driving every meter of this pass at every hour and in every condition, because this was his mountain and his commute and his daughter's school route, and he knew it the way other people know their own handwriting. He had one working radio channel, and he found Elizabeth's sedan on the security frequency from a manifest he had photographed during setup. He keyed the radio. He said her name. He told her the brakes were gone. He said to trust him once. The voice came through the static clearly enough. Elizabeth heard it. She recognized it immediately. What Logan Mercer did over the next 4 minutes on that mountain road would not translate cleanly into the language of emergency response or automotive engineering, not because it defied those disciplines, but because the kind of mastery he brought to those curves existed in a space where technical knowledge, physical memory, and the willingness to absorb damage on behalf of someone else converge into a single sustained act of judgment. He had not drifted a car competitively in 11 years. The knowledge had not gone anywhere. The body remembers what the mind would prefer to put away. The first intervention was lateral. Logan pulled the AE86 alongside Elizabeth's sedan on its outer edge, between the sedan and the guardrail, and held that position as the car continued its drift toward the drop. He used the AE86 as a physical boundary, letting the sedan's rear quarter make contact with his front fender, using the force transfer to arrest the sedan's rotation. The AE86's fender compressed. The headlight housing cracked, and Logan absorbed the impact through the steering wheel in a continuous shudder up both forearms. He held. The sedan's rotation slowed, stabilized, and Frank regained enough alignment to manage the gradient toward the next straightaway. The first SUV came immediately, recognizing what had happened and refusing to accept it. It accelerated into the AE86's rear quarter, trying to push Logan out of the protective position. Logan let the SUV push him, let the rear step, let the car begin a controlled drift toward the inner lane, then used the angle of that drift to come back faster than the SUV's driver could adjust, putting the AE86 across the intended attack line. The SUV braked hard. Its tires found the edge of a drainage repair, a section patched with aggregate that had never properly bonded, and the vehicle's rear lost purchase. It spun wide onto the shoulder, nose buried in the embankment. Done. Logan's hands were cut where the wheel had found the cracked grip tape on the second impact. He was aware of it the way you're aware of something that will matter later and cannot matter now. He carried a clear picture of the road ahead, 400 meters of descending curve, the hairpin locals called the notch, and then the long sweep onto the plateau where the gradient gentled. The second SUV was still in play. He could see it in the mirror, hanging back, recalculating. Carter's operation had not included an AE86. The car was not supposed to be here. Neither was Logan. He reached Elizabeth on the radio. He told her the notch was 300 meters ahead, that it was the sharpest curve on the entire descent, and that Frank needed to let the car run wide on the entry rather than fight the geometry, because with no effective braking they would need every meter of available road width to manage the curve. He said it quickly and without elaboration, the way a man who has thought about emergencies longer than is comfortable speaks when an emergency is actually happening. Inside the sedan, Elizabeth relayed every word to Frank without pause or modification. She had found the place inside herself that exists beyond fear, where the mind becomes entirely operational because there is simply no alternative, and she used it completely. Frank nodded at each instruction. He was a professional, and professionals, when given accurate information from a source that has proven itself reliable, execute. The second SUV accelerated for its final attempt as the notch approached. It had identified the hairpin as the point of maximum vulnerability and wanted to make its intervention there rather than on the open road. Logan saw it coming in the mirror. He calculated the timing against the SUV's closing speed and made a decision that he would not have been able to fully articulate, because it was not a decision arrived at through deliberation. It was arrived at through the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent a decade learning what roads can do and what cars can bear under pressure. He took the AE86 into the notch early, at an angle no casual driver would attempt on a wet surface, letting the rear step out in a long, arcing slide that swept across both lanes of the hairpin. The tail caught the SUV's front corner at a contact point that transferred maximum rotational force to the pursuing vehicle without destroying the AE86's own trajectory. Drift geometry Logan understood in his hands rather than his head. The SUV spun. Its driver overcorrected. The outside wheels caught the lip of the drainage channel at the road's edge, and the SUV folded against the lower guardrail with an impact that brought it to absolute rest across the shoulder. Logan brought the AE86 through the remainder of the notch, straightened it on the exit, and guided Elizabeth's sedan along the final approach onto the plateau road. The rain kept falling. Frank pulled the sedan off onto the wide gravel shoulder and stopped. Logan stopped the AE86 beside it. For a moment there was only the rain on the roofs and the ticking of metal beginning to cool. Logan opened his door and stepped out. His left shoulder had contacted the doorframe hard on the second impact, and lifting the arm produced a pain that radiated down to the elbow. The AE86's right side was caved in from the front fender back to the door jamb. Both headlights on that side were gone, and a thin column of steam was beginning to rise from the stressed radiator. He walked to Elizabeth's sedan and stood at the rear passenger window. Elizabeth opened the door and stood in the rain. She was not visibly injured. She looked at him, at the cut hand, at the held-down shoulder, at the collapsed right side of the car behind him. She looked at the AE86 the way you look at something that has just demonstrated that your understanding of the nature of things was fundamentally incomplete. She tried to find words. Logan spoke first. He asked if she was breathing all right. She said she was. He nodded once and looked back up the road toward the notch, where the red lights of the stalled SUVs were just visible through the rain. The police arrived within 18 minutes, directed by a GPS distress signal Frank had triggered just before the jammer reached full effect. They came with 3 cruisers and an ambulance, followed by a response team from Elizabeth's security firm, the same firm whose certification Logan had bypassed to save a life they had failed to protect. 2 of Carter's men were taken from the crashed vehicles. One of them, the driver who had pushed at the notch, began talking almost immediately. He had not agreed to a collision at 40 miles an hour on a wet mountain road in the dark. He had agreed to what Carter had called a careful operation, and the distance between those descriptions was wide enough to dissolve whatever loyalty remained. His account was specific. Carter Whitfield had identified Elizabeth's mountain resort project as sitting atop a geological corridor containing a privately assessed mineral deposit and transit access points worth, by his calculations, somewhere between 6 and 9 times the project's publicly advertised valuation. The brake line sabotage had been Carter's contingency, deployed after Elizabeth's final refusal to sell, designed to stage a fatal accident and trigger a succession clause in the company's charter that Carter had identified as a leverage point. It was not a crime of impulse. It was a business decision made by a man who had concluded that the line between aggressive commerce and murder was a technicality. Elizabeth sat on the back step of the ambulance while a paramedic examined the bruising along her forearm. She heard the account relayed to her security director and felt a specific, nauseating recognition settle in. Every piece of information Logan had given her, the brake line fitting, the discoloration, the nature of the interference, had been correct. Not approximately, precisely. She had dismissed it with the same clinical indifference she applied to any input from a source she had already filed under a category she had assigned in 5 seconds. She had not merely made a judgment error. She had made the error and then amplified it in public, for the entertainment of investors she was trying to impress. Mia arrived at the plateau 40 minutes later, having driven down from the resort when the event staff relayed what was happening on the pass. She came through the police perimeter, found Elizabeth, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You're alive. Thank God." And then, "He tried to tell you." Elizabeth said she knew. Mia said it again, not to punish, but because the fact needed to exist in the air between them with enough weight to be fully felt. Elizabeth said she knew, and this time the flatness in her voice had been replaced by something more honest. Logan was being treated for the hand laceration and shoulder contusion at the ambulance. The medic taped his palm, said the shoulder was likely a strain rather than a tear, and told him to have it imaged within 24 hours. Logan said he would. He retrieved his clipboard from the AE86 out of habit and was standing near the car, looking at the caved-in side panel, when Elizabeth came to him. Several officers and members of her security team were close enough to observe. She stopped in front of him and said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without the calibration of a prepared statement, just the admission that she had been wrong in a way that had nearly cost everything. Logan looked at her for a moment. He said that apologizing for the car was the easy part. He said what she had done in front of those investors hadn't been a comment about a vehicle, it had been a decision about what kind of person she thought he was, made in 5 seconds without a single accurate piece of information. He said he had been driving that road for 7 years, working on engines since he was 15, had walked away from a career some people would have considered remarkable and built something honest from its remains. And none of that had been visible to her because she hadn't looked. He was not angry when he said it. Anger would have been easier for her to absorb. He was simply stating what was true. The silence that followed had genuine weight. Elizabeth had been corrected in boardrooms, by lawyers, by competitors, by CFOs when numbers didn't cooperate. She had never been corrected in a way that made her feel the precise texture of her own arrogance, not as strategic error, not as a communication failure, but as something she had done directly to a person who had not deserved it. She looked at the AE86. The right side was folded. The hood had popped slightly from the frame stress. The car looked like it had been in a fight, which it had, and had not come out clean, which it hadn't, but it was standing on all 4 wheels in the rain. Carter Whitfield had not been at either crash site. When his network of contacts relayed that both SUVs were disabled, that police had arrived, and that Elizabeth was alive, he had left the rented house and was already on a different road. He was not yet in custody, and he was not a man who accepted the end of a game without attempting to construct an alternative version of events. He needed distance and a narrative. He had, as it turned out, both. The footage appeared at 7:43 the following morning, submitted to 3 news organizations with a summary framing it as a tip from a concerned witness. It was 31 seconds of dashcam video from Carter's SUV before the first collision, the AE86 following close behind the convoy, weaving between lanes, making an aggressive approach from the rear. Out of context, stripped of the brake failure, stripped of the second SUV, stripped of everything that preceded those 31 seconds, it looked exactly like what Carter intended, a man in a modified car pursuing and harassing a convoy for potentially sinister purposes. The narrative accompanying the footage was precise in its falsity. Carter's communications network, operating through several intermediary accounts, released talking points suggesting that Logan Mercer was a known street racing enthusiast with an apparent fixation on high-profile vehicles, that his presence at the resort event had been unauthorized, and that his involvement in the incident bore the hallmarks of a manufactured crisis designed to achieve either publicity or financial leverage. The word used most consistently was stunt. The implication was not that Logan had done nothing, but that what he had done had been calculated for maximum personal benefit, that the rescue was a performance staged for an audience. The story moved quickly. Logan's garage lost 4 appointments in the first 3 hours. His neighbor left a message asking if he was managing. A woman whose son he had spent 2 years teaching basic engine maintenance canceled without explanation. Logan sat at his workbench reading the coverage on his phone with the stillness of someone who has been here before, not in this exact form, but in the experience of being evaluated on incomplete information and found wanting. He did not call a lawyer. He did not draft a statement. He had a water pump replacement due on a Ford pickup, and he completed the work. Elizabeth's board of directors convened an emergency call at 9 that morning. The senior members were unified in their assessment. The situation carried risk of distraction at a sensitive time in the company's development. 3 significant investment commitments were pending. The regulatory review of the resort project was ongoing. The recommendation, delivered in the careful language of people who have learned that directness creates liability, was that Elizabeth should allow the police investigation to proceed without making public statements that associated the company's interests with Logan Mercer's personal circumstances. The message was diplomatic. What it meant was, leave him exposed. Mia called at 10:17. She did not ask how Elizabeth was feeling. She said, "You know exactly what happened on that road." Elizabeth confirmed she did. Mia said, "Then you know what has to happen next." Elizabeth said the board's position was not unreasonable given the current information environment, and Mia said the information environment only existed because Elizabeth had the facts and was choosing not to release them. There was a silence on the line. Mia said that Logan had followed a convoy he had zero obligation to follow, on a road that nearly killed him, to protect a woman who had insulted him to investors' faces that same afternoon. She said whatever the board thought about market optics, this was a moment that would define who Elizabeth actually was when the decision was genuinely inconvenient. Elizabeth called her chief communications officer at 11 and requested 2 items: the complete technical report from the brake system forensics, which the police department had already compiled, and the full event footage from the resort's exterior cameras, which her team had archived. She also requested the logged maintenance certifications from her security firm, including the identifying signature of the technician who had last inspected the vehicle. She said she needed everything prepared for a press statement that afternoon. Her communications officer asked if she was certain about the timing. Elizabeth said she was certain about the content. The press conference took place at 3 in the afternoon. Elizabeth stood without notes. She described the timeline, what Logan had observed and reported, what she had dismissed, and what had followed. She presented the forensic brake report and the resort camera footage, including the segment showing Logan filing his inspection form and approaching the security director, and stated plainly that the man the morning's coverage had characterized as a predator was the man who had been right when every person she paid to be right had been wrong. She said she owed Logan Mercer a public correction, and she was delivering it. Carter Whitfield, she confirmed, was the subject of an active criminal investigation. She also said something that had not been in the talking points her communications officer prepared, that she had laughed at Logan's car in front of a crowd of investors, and that the arrogance driving that laugh had nearly cost her everything. She said it because it was true, and because she had decided in the 18 hours since the plateau that truth was something she had been rationing too carefully for too long. Carter's media operation collapsed under the forensic evidence within 4 hours of the press conference. The pending investment commitments steadied. 2 media organizations issued corrections. Logan's phone did not ring with apologies from the clients who had canceled, but his inbox received a message from a regional automotive publication asking if he would be interviewed about mountain driving technique. He declined. Carter Whitfield had been watching the press conference stream on his phone from a rented car 30 kilometers north when he understood that the landscape had changed in a way that could not be reversed through media management. His driver had given a detailed account. The forensic report had been released publicly. The investigation had the momentum of a case with most of its components already assembled. He made a call to Elizabeth's personal number, which he had retained from an earlier period when their professional relationship had been cordial, and he said he wanted to discuss a resolution. Elizabeth did not engage with the offer. She relayed the call to the lead investigator. Carter recognized the direct channel was closed. The following morning, Elizabeth's executive assistant Sarah, 30 years old, 6 years with the company, professionally composed in the way that people who are fundamentally competent become composed, did not arrive at the office. Her phone went to voicemail. Security records showed she had left her apartment building at 7:14 and had not returned. At 9:30, Elizabeth received a message from an unregistered number describing Sarah's location in general terms and stating that her release required Elizabeth to deliver the complete project filing documents to a meeting point to be confirmed closer to the time. The message said that if police were detected within 2 kilometers of the exchange location, the outcome for Sarah would be entirely at Carter's discretion. Elizabeth called Logan. She could not have explained why she called him before the lead investigator, except that she did. Logan heard her voice and the particular quality of it and said he was on his way. They met at the base of the pass road, Logan driving the repaired AE86 with its caved right side panel and its mismatched replacement headlight, and Elizabeth in a plain rental car. He did not ask why she had called him. She explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, then said that Carter had chosen the old unpaved access route to the north because it offered the most exit options and the least traffic visibility. He said he knew every meter of the route. He said Carter would have calibrated his response around professional opposition, security teams, coordinated vehicles, and would not have accounted for a single man in a 30-year-old Japanese hatchback. Logan adapted a recording device from his diagnostic kit to capture audio from the interior of the AE86 and activated a location-sharing link on his phone which he sent to the lead investigator before they left, along with a text message giving Carter's likely location and an estimated arrival time of 40 minutes. The investigator replied asking Logan not to engage directly. Logan did not reply. The exchange point was a disused equipment shed set back from the dirt access road behind a rusted iron gate. Elizabeth went in on foot with a document portfolio prepared with the investigator's guidance, formatted to appear complete while containing nothing beyond what was already in the public record. Sarah was inside the shed, uninjured, wrists bound, frightened but composed in the specific way of someone who has decided that composed is the most useful thing they can be right now. Carter was there with one other person, a man whose positioning communicated a function rather than an accompaniment. Carter examined the portfolio. He spent roughly 40 seconds believing he had achieved what he came for, and in those 40 seconds the sound of a vehicle arriving on the access road registered not as threat but as background noise. Logan had not entered the property. He had parked the AE86 across the gate, engine running, blocking both tire ruts of the only exit. When Carter emerged and saw the car sitting in his path, he stopped. He looked at the vehicle and then at Logan. He made the calculation that this was one man in a damaged car, and that his own performance sedan parked behind the shed gave him sufficient speed advantage to make the calculation irrelevant. Carter broke for his vehicle and gained the access road heading north. Logan followed at distance, letting Carter open a gap on the first straight. The route was narrow, unpaved, and pocked with erosion channels from years of seasonal runoff and zero maintenance. Logan knew everyone, because this road connected the plateau to a fire route near the resort's northern service area and was his fastest winter route when the main pass iced over. Carter drove the way panicking men with fast cars drive, maximum throttle applied to a road that demanded patience. He recovered from the first erosion channel, and the second. He did not find the third until he was fully committed to a left-hand apex where it was invisible until the car was already in it, and by then the sedan's rear was 3 feet offline with nothing left to recover with. The sedan came to rest against a row of old timber posts at the road's edge. Front axle dropped into the drainage channel, both front tires destroyed. Carter got out and moved toward the tree line. He covered perhaps 40 meters before 2 police vehicles came down the fire road from the north, directed there by Logan's location share, and the officers had him on the ground before he reached the tree line. Elizabeth stood at the gate and watched the officers bring Carter back to the access road in handcuffs. He looked diminished, smaller than he had appeared in conference rooms 2 years earlier, full of projections and the confidence of a man who believed every deal bent to sufficient pressure. He did not look at her. She watched them put him in the vehicle and thought about the suffering that had been a direct consequence of his arithmetic. Then she walked back and found Sarah sitting on a rock with a water bottle, and Elizabeth sat down beside her without any consideration of how it looked. Logan was leaning against the AE86's undamaged side when Elizabeth returned. He was ready to go, and was waiting only because driving away immediately would have been its own kind of statement. She came to stand beside him. She said, "Thank you." He said he had already heard that version. She said she understood, and that she also meant the other thing, what he had said on the plateau, about how she had looked at him. She said it had stayed with her in a way that she hadn't been able to set aside. 17 days passed. Elizabeth moved through them with the particular disorientation of someone whose fundamental self-assessment has been disturbed, not overturned, but disturbed, like a reference point that has been shifted by a fraction and now requires everything aligned to it to be recalibrated. She settled the criminal referral with her legal team, consolidated the resort project's regulatory position, and declined 4 interview requests seeking a performance of the experience for consumption. She accepted one, a long-form conversation with a business publication, and gave an answer to the question of what she had learned that was considerably more honest than her communications officer had advised. She drove to Logan's garage on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the resort launch. She came in a compact rental car and parked on the street outside. She walked through the open bay door carrying a cardboard box, the kind that quality aftermarket parts arrive in, and set it on his workbench without preamble. Logan looked at it, then at her. He said he wasn't looking for compensation. She said she understood that, and that the components were not compensation, they were replacement parts for damage that had occurred because of a situation she had created by dismissing a warning delivered in good faith. She said he was welcome to send them back, but she had checked the specifications herself against the AE86's chassis year, and it would be a waste. Logan did not open the box immediately. He stood looking at it, then said he had one condition. Elizabeth waited. He said the right side panel was going to keep the fold, the shallow crease running from the front fender to the door jamb, from being pressed against the guardrail at speed. He would not have it filled or repainted. She asked why. He said the car had earned it, and that things worth remembering were better carried in the things themselves than in photographs or stories. A car that looked like it had done something was more honest than one that only looked new. Elizabeth agreed. She sat down on a stool near the workbench, not with the deliberate ease of someone performing comfort, but with the simple motion of a person who was tired from standing and decided to stop. She watched Logan open the box and check the parts against his notes. The garage had the specific quiet of a working space where the work is real, not the absence of sound but the presence of purposeful sound rather than conversational sound. She said she had a question. He said to go ahead. She asked how he had become that kind of driver, the kind who could do what he had done at the Notch in the Rain without losing either the car or the calculation. He set down the part he was holding. He said that before Daisy in the garage, he had competed in amateur mountain circuit events and been good enough that professional teams made serious approaches. He had driven the way young men who are very capable tend to drive, fast, with the arrogance of believing skill alone was sufficient protection. One night, a different mountain road, he misjudged a corner by 2 meters. His co-driver wasn't seriously hurt, but the margin had been close enough, and the look on his co-driver's face afterward had been close enough, that Logan spent a long time understanding what he'd actually been risking. He stepped away from competition. He kept driving. Arrogance was the problem. Not driving, but he kept it local and proportional. Elizabeth listened to this and was quiet for a moment. She said she thought she understood the parallel. He did not confirm or deny it. He picked up the part again and continued checking specifications. The morning they took the AE86 out, on the lower switchback section, the public road that locals used for early drives on clear days, the light came down through the tree line in long, horizontal angles that crossed the asphalt in intervals, the way it does at elevation when the sun is still low and the air is cold enough to hold its shape. Elizabeth sat in the passenger seat. The car carried the smell of fresh oil and old upholstery and something metallic that was not unpleasant. The crease in the right door panel was visible from her seat, running in a shallow arc across the surface, unhidden and unashamed, exactly as Logan had required. He drove the way he drove with no emergency to respond to, with a loose attentiveness that translated the road's texture through the wheel without commentary. Elizabeth watched the small corrections through the curves, adjustments so minor they were nearly imperceptible, the continuous work of a man who reads the road rather than reacts to it. She had spent 17 years making large, visible decisions in rooms full of people who were watching. She thought about the decision Logan had made 3 weeks ago, alone in a service lot, following a convoy whose driver had laughed at his car in front of investors that same afternoon, because the alternative was to let something preventable happen. She asked him, finally, the question she had been carrying. She asked why, after everything she had said in front of those investors, he had followed the convoy onto that road. Logan took a long curve before he answered. He said he had a daughter who was going to grow up in a world shaped by decisions people made when those decisions were inconvenient, and that he couldn't teach her anything worth knowing if what he taught was only true when it was easy. He said a person's life doesn't get weighed against how they've behaved at their worst, and that he had known, standing in that service lot watching the convoy leave, that something was going to go wrong, and that choosing not to act was itself a decision, one he'd made once on a different mountain, and had never fully stopped paying for. Elizabeth did not speak for a while after that. The AE86 carried them along the lower switchback, through the dappled morning light, the crease in the door panel catching sun in intervals, honest, present, and permanent. She looked at the road ahead, and for the first time in years she was not already calculating what came next in the sequence of things she needed to manage. She was simply present, in the car, on the road, in the particular quiet of a morning that had no agenda. The AE86 rounded the final bend of the lower switchback and emerged onto the short plateau road where the tree line pulled back and the full arc of the valley opened below them, the distant ranges blue in the morning air. Logan kept a steady pace. The engine turned over with the quiet confidence of something well-maintained and genuinely trusted, carrying 2 people through a landscape that had recently tested both of them, and that had, in the end, revealed something true about each. The car climbed toward the morning. Neither of them needed to say anything more.
My heart's racing. My heart's a racing. What's up, Zeno? How you doing? What's up, Zeno? The Wukong method. Is this game stressful? Not yet. That part was a tiny bit. Zeno! I swear I just collected it. Did I collect it? What is it doing now? His top 3 summons. You unlock that in like an hour? Okay. Let's go. We did it. Moving along. Y'all ready? Let's get it. I need the next shrine. Take me to the shrine. Oh wow. I need the shrine. I got no health. Please. Oh no.